right? The government will use a market mechanism to internalize external cost. Like this can mean imposing indirect taxes, and sometimes the government directly provides public goods, right? Because private sector never provides public goods because those are not profitable to produce. Market failure theory, this has been mentioned over here. Market failure theory has developed methods to evaluate government actions, usually through cost benefit analysis, which has limitation in its effectiveness, right? So basically, cost benefit analysis is this technique where you calculate the social cost and social benefits of a project, and then you evaluate whether that project is beneficial and that should be implemented or should that not be implemented, right? The cost benefit analysis then informs an assessment of the principal agent structure that will force private agents to do what the government wants, right? So through cost benefit analysis, it is saying that you can make private agents, private sector, right, do what the government wants. Critics of market failure theory say that it assumes that the government only fixes existing problems, and this is not as useful as a policy that creates dynamic new markets or products. However, this can lead to accusation of crowding out private sector businesses. Now, what is crowding out private sector businesses? So think about this. Crowding out means, right, Arba, crowding out basically means that when government is spending more, that will push private investment, that will reduce private investment. Crowding out, when government is investing more, right, on different projects, that reduces the investment available to the private sector. This is what it means. When government is spending more, let me write this down. When government spends more on different projects, that reduces the funds available to private sector for investment on different projects, that reduces availability of funds for private sector to invest. Availability of funds to private sector to invest, right? So this means that the government has crowded out the private sector investment, availability of funds to private sector for investments. So in simple words, more of government spending will reduce the amount available to the private sector for investment, right? So, I mean, that's a negative effect that the government can have on the private sector, right? So that is what it means. Okay, now moving on, government is producing efficiently. I mean, so are you talking about crowding out or are you talking about something else? So crowding out specifically means that with more government spending, having better education than private sector, right? Right. So government would be, yeah, true. So government would be spending on obviously things that are needed by the society, but then some economists say that it will lead to crowding out, which is a negative effect. Why is that a negative effect? Because as per the concept of crowding out, more government spending, have a look at this, more government spending on different projects that reduces availability of funds to private sector for investment. So if government spending is going up, so it simply means this. If government is spending more on different projects, then it reduces the investment that the private sector would make in the economy. That is what it basically means, right? So that will reduce investment made by the private sector, right? Which is obviously not a good thing. So that is what crowding out means. Okay, now moving on and continuing with our case study, right? So, however, this can lead to accusations of crowding out private sector businesses, right? The argument against those critics rests on showing how government investment causes both a large output that can be shared between private and public sectors and create cost savings, right? On the other hand, some people say the argument against those critiques rests on showing how government investment causes both larger output. So they are saying that, when government is spending more, we know that aggregate demand increases. When aggregate demand increases, that will result in more national GDP, right? More national output that can be shared between private and public sectors and create cost savings. Savings are also taking place, right? However, this argument does not include the idea that the goal of public investment is just more than just increasing output. It should also be, as Keynes wrote, to do those things which at present are not done at all, right? So Keynesian economists, we know about Keynesian economists, and what do Keynesian economists believe? They always emphasize on government spending more and government taking a much active role in managing the economy, right? So Keynesians were very different from classical, or very different from classical economists. Classical economist says that government intervention should be minimal, right? So government should not intervene a lot in the private sector operations, whereas Keynes believe the complete opposite, and they say that the government should very actively participate in managing the economy and regulating the private sector. Okay. In fact, new events that have transformed economies have also been influenced on both demand and supply sides by policy making. The iPhone Global Positioning System, GPS, touchscreen displays, solar power, and wind farms, for example, were all publicly funded, right? So they're saying that, the GPS system, Global Positioning System, right? The GPS, the navigation system that we use nowadays, the touchscreen displays, solar power, and wind farms were all publicly funded. That is what it says. Okay. Now, after reading the case study, right, Arbaab, is everything clear? So if everything is clear, then we can move towards the question. Okay. Now, this is saying, okay, perfect, great. Explain what is meant by principal agent problem and describe how it can be applied to government and private sector businesses, right? Okay. Now think about this. Now, how can this principal agent problem be applied to what is this principal agent problem, and describe how it can be applied to governments and private sector businesses. Okay, now think about this. Principal agent problem, if you remember, we talked about this before as well, and we talked with regards to oligopoly markets or big companies, right? Now, who is principal? So principal is the owner of any business, right? Right? So principal agent problem refers to the fact that the shareholders are oftentimes not the people who are managing it. Similarly, think of any, this is the example that I just gave you for, was for private sector, right? So let me write down the definition here. Principal agent problem refers to the problem that shareholders are oftentimes not the ones who are managing the business. Shareholders are not the ones managing the business, and therefore, right? So who is managing the business? The managers, and they are known as agents because they are working on behalf of someone. And therefore, the agents, who are basically the managers of a company, might take decisions which are not in the best interest of the shareholders. Might take decisions which are not in the best interest of the shareholders. Right? Is this making sense? That are not in the best interest of agents. Oh, sorry, in the best interest of shareholders. Is to your, right? What do you mean by BOD? Right? Board of directors, right? Yeah, true, right? And then if you want to apply this principal agent problem to a government organization, right? Now, what is the problem? Right? Take decisions. Exactly, right? And then obviously board of directors are taking decisions above, but then there are some other people involved as well, right? So board of directors are obviously from the shareholders, but they are not directly involved in the day-to-day operations. Obviously, they're looking after the big issues like whom to hire as the CEO and what should be the long-term growth strategy for the company and so on. So they're involved in more strategic decisions. On the other hand, the managers are involved in the day-to-day operations of the business, right? Sales, marketing, finance, and so on, right? So that's the problem, that these agents are not these managers might not always be trying to maximize the value of shareholders. Why? Because they are trying to maximize their own benefit. How are they trying to maximize their own benefit? They're trying to get more salaries, they're trying to get more comfort for themselves, and all these different things, right? So that is the problem with principal agent problem. If we want to apply this concept to public organizations, public corporations, right? So the problem of principal agent problem, in public corporations is that the government obviously hire people to get things done, right? In public corporations, who are the people who are making the decisions, like day-to-day decisions? Obviously, these are different people, employees in the organization and so on, right? So VAPDA, think about it. So VAPDA is providing electricity in Pakistan. It's the only company that produces electricity and distribute electricity in Pakistan. If the managers in VAPDA are not very efficient, right, and they do not have a lot of interest in providing best quality service to the citizens, then obviously VAPDA would not be doing a very efficient role, right? Employees are not working for the best interest of the company or the objectives that the government has laid for that organization. Employees might not be working for the best interest of the company, right? So obviously we know what is the primary objective of any public corporation, that is to provide best possible service to its customers, right? Citizens, right? But obviously being inefficient employees, sometimes they are not providing the best service that the customers need, might not be working for the best interest of the company, right? So that's the problem here, right? Students, are you following me? So that is what you need to remember. So what you will explain in this question, let's look at this question one more time. So the question was saying for 4 marks, explain what is meant by principal agent problem and describe how it can be applied to governments and private sector businesses. So for that, first of all, you need to define this term principal agent problem. So for that, you can say refer to problem that shareholders are not the ones managing the business, and therefore the agents, managers of a company might not take decisions that might take decisions that are not in the best interest of shareholders, right? So they are not maximizing their value, shareholders value. And similarly in public corporations, the same is true. Employees might not be working for the best interest of company. Therefore, like think about PIA, right? So PIA every year goes in a loss. Pakistan Railway every year goes in a loss because the management, right, the team is not very efficient and they're not working very hard to improve the profitability of the company and to run it in the most efficient manner, because they don't really care, right? Therefore these public corporations are working inefficiently, right? So let's do all the questions first, and then we can look at the marking scheme. Or if you want me to look at the marking scheme first and do a question, then look at the marking scheme and so on, we can also do that. Corporations are often not managed very efficiently. Managed very efficiently. Is this simple? Any confusion? Anything you want to ask? Anything you want to say? Okay, now let's quickly go and see what the marking scheme says about this, right? This was 4.3, this is 4.1, this is 4.2, this is 4.3. Okay, now can you see this? Perfect. Right? Okay. This is the general, how marks are allocated, right? Theory, knowledge. Where's the question? Okay. Now it is usually applied to possible conflicts of interest that may result between shareholders, principal, and management agent of a firm. So that was for 1 mark. Or in case between those who form the rules, the government principal, and those who carry out the rules, businesses agents, right? The conflict could occur because the businesses do not seek to achieve what is good for the wider society, right? So that's the thing, right? So they are only working for their own interest and they are not concerned much about what is happening in the what should be done for the society, as I was telling you, right? That public corporations are not getting the best results for the citizens and for the society, which they should. Outline what articles means when it mentions inefficient resource allocation, 4 marks. This should be simple. We have talked about this again and again in the concept of economic efficiency, right? Now, what is, let's look at the question one more time. So the question was saying, okay, outline what the article means when it means inefficient resource allocation. Inefficient resource allocation. Yes, right? So what is inefficient resource allocation? If you remember, we talked about this concept, economic efficiency. Economic efficiency simply means that to make the best possible use of resources, right? Because every country has limited resources, and with those limited resources, it wants to maximize its output, produce as much as it can, and so on and so forth. So if an economy is not achieving efficiency in the use of its resources, wastage of resources, exactly, that will be defined as inefficiency. Now, economic efficiency comprises of two types of efficiency, productive and allocative. Productive efficiency is what you are referring to, like if your resources are being wasted, which means that you're not maximizing your output with each input that you're using, that would be productively inefficient. And then comes in allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency is when you are not able to allocative efficiency is when you are producing goods that are most wanted or most needed by the people. So producing the right type of goods in the right quantity. So let me also write this down for you. Producing right type of goods in the right quantities. Producing right type of goods in right or appropriate quantities, right? Okay, so if you remember, I'll come to the graph and explain you how through graphs we can tell if a firm is allocatively efficient or not. Appropriate quantities, right? Okay, now students, this was allocative efficiency, like producing right type of goods in the right appropriate quantities. And what is productive efficiency? Maximizing output with the use of resources, maximizing output with use of resources, right? And the way we look at productive efficiency, think about this. So for productive efficiency, the formula is output over input. So what do you need to do with this? You need to maximize the value of this formula. How will you maximize the value of this formula? When your output is maximized with any use of input, that is productive efficiency. And how do we look at productive efficiency through a graph? So we look at productive efficiency through a graph by looking at the ATC curves, right? So average total cost curve. So if you're operating on the lowest possible ATC curve, then it means that the company is productively efficient, otherwise it's not, right? So let's say these are the three possible ATCs that the firm can operate on, right? So you have ATC 1, you have ATC 2, and you have, let's say, ATC 3, right? Where is it? Okay, so right. And then if you're producing on the lowest possible ATC curve, which in this case is ATC 3, then it means that you're productively efficient, otherwise you are not, right? So this graph, you can also draw this graph to explain this. We can show it also by PPC as well when it's full employment, right? Yes, you can also use PPC curve to tell that when you are operating, when the economy is operating on the production possibility curve, that is productively efficient, otherwise it is not. Very good, excellent. And how do we show allocative efficiency? How do we show allocative efficiency and see whether a firm is allocatively efficient or not? So for that, you need to look at the demand curve and the marginal cost. You need to look at the demand curve and marginal cost, right? So if you are producing, if the company is producing at the level where the demand curve of a firm, which also shows you the price, is equal to its marginal cost. It's equal to its marginal cost. So on the y-axis, you have cost slash price. So on the y-axis, you have cost slash price. So let me quickly show you, right? And this is your marginal cost. So where price is equals to marginal cost, that quantity is allocatively efficient. Anything less than that is allocatively inefficient. Anything more than that is allocatively inefficient, right? So this is your allocatively efficient output, QA, allocatively efficient. Exactly, excellent, right? So again, the question was saying, what does the term says? What does it mean when it says that there is inefficiency in the use of resources? So you will quickly tell that economic efficiency means making the best possible use of resources, because all countries have limited resources. Economic efficiency comprises of two components of efficiency, productive and allocative. What is productive? Making maximizing output with use of resources. Sorry, over here you should have had use maximizing output with use of resources. right? And then you can use that graph, um, right? ATC graph that we just looked at, maximize output with use of resources, and allocative efficiency is producing right type of goods in the right quantities, right? Then you can make the graph explain that, and then very briefly mention that in what cases there's market failure. So market failure happens when there is absence of one of these components. Like if there are externalities, we know what happens in externalities. Negative externalities are overproduced. Private firms will always cause more pollution, right? Individuals will cause more pollution through their cars, right? And the way the government deals with these market failure is through use of policies, is through use of regulations, taxation, and policies, right? So externalities, um, sorry, externalities, market failure. I wanted to write, right? So market failure happens due to externality, because market has failed to achieve economic efficiency. Then there's no provision of public good, which the case study also talks about, right? That the private sector never produces public good because it's not profitable for them to produce public goods, right? So who has to provide those public goods? Obviously the government, right? No provision of public goods, monopoly, right? When there's one dominant firm that is exploiting consumers, that's also a case of market failure. No provision of public goods, monopoly, right? So these are all the cases. So when these cases are present, that is known as inefficient use of resources, which we define as market failure. As simple as that. Exactly. Excellent, right? So this is what you will talk about. So if you have to go and quickly look at the case study, right? It says producing an output which is either not productively efficient, minimum cost for the output in question, or allocatively efficient, marginal cost does not equal the marginal social benefit, right? Which is the price. Very good. Great. So this being said, right, where is the question? So the next question says, the article refers to internalizing external cost. Explain what economist means by this and consider whether cost benefit analysis can be used to achieve this, right? Okay, what we don't provide answers according to case study, we won't get marks for it. Okay, now that's a good question. Think about this. In this question, in this question, we saw that the question was more general, inefficient resource allocation. The case study doesn't directly give you the answer. The case study is not directly giving you the answer because it did not even define what market failure is. Because that is exactly the question. They want you to know as a student that what is market failure and what does it mean. Now, nowhere in the case study it talks about productive efficiency or allocative efficiency, but you saw for yourself that the marking scheme is talking about productive and allocative efficiency. So long story short, there will be few questions that need to be answered from the case study when it says that with the help of the graph, answer the, like the question, the case study that we were doing yesterday, in that it asked you to compare the graph, like the changes in money supply and the effect on inflation. In that case, obviously you will have to answer it directly by looking at the graph, right? You can't use any of your theory that you know, right? You have to look at the graph. But for questions like these, where there is no direct information provided in the case study, which you would know after reading the case study, then you have to answer it on your own from the knowledge that you have, from the knowledge that you have gained in the syllabus, right? So that's how it's done, right? Yeah. Okay. Now the next question says, okay, the next question here says, okay, the article refers to internalizing external cost. Explain what economists mean by this and consider whether cost benefit analysis can be used to achieve it. Okay. Now, what is internalizing? Again, the question is asking you, which hasn't been explained in the case study, right? It just very briefly says that this involves taking measures such as devising market mechanism to internalize external cost or the direct provision of public goods. But it doesn't explain you what internalizing the externality means, right? So now we know that since the case study is not directly providing you the answers, so you have to write it from your own knowledge that you have gained in the syllabus, right? Now, if you remember, I did use this term in our explanation of externalities, internalizing the external cost. Now, what is external cost? Let's first talk about this. So external cost is basically negative externalities which happens when you're not, when you're doing something that is harmful for the society. So doing something that is harmful for the society, that is external cost, right? Negative externality. So let me give you an example. So if let's say you are, what is that called? So if let's say there is a business that is causing pollution, right? So that is external cost, right? That is external cost, right? Now, what does it mean to internalize that externality? That you make that person who is causing pollution to pay for the pollution, right? Means, right? So internalizing the external cost means making the person or the entity, right? Depending upon who is involved in the situation, making the person or the entity pay for the negative externality that they are causing, like pollution, smoking that causes criminality, right? Smoking, because that causes passive smoking, right? Means making the person or the entity pay for the negative externality like pollution, smoking, etc. Overspeeding, right? Pollution, smoking, etc. Right? Okay. Now, students, think about this. So, if you remember, you can also make the graph for this question if you're comfortable. If you're not, then you can explain in your own words. Right? Now, how does internalizing the externality happens? If you remember the graph that we made for the externality in our syllabus, right? What we said was that social cost and social benefits are made up of two components. Have a look at this. So social cost is the total cost to the society of producing something, and that comprises of private cost and external cost. What is private cost? Private cost is the cost faced by the first party. So think about this. If I'm using my car, when I use my car, who pays for the fuel? Who pays for the fuel? And who pays for the maintenance of the car and all that stuff, right? So the cost that the person directly involved in the transaction has to pay, that is known as private cost, right? So I'm the one, obviously, I own the car, so I will be paying for the fuel. Similarly, in the case of your parents pay for the fuel and the maintenance of your car. So that cost is directly borne by the first party, right? First party means anyone who is directly involved in the transaction. External cost, on the other hand, is faced by third party who is not directly involved in the transaction. So my decision to use my private car is causing cost to the society. How so? Because there are so many cars on the road and they all cause pollution. We know this, carbon monoxide, right? Which is a harmful gas in the environment, right? So that is external cost, right? Similarly, another example, yes, pollution, very good. Another example, another, another example that I can give you for this is, think about this. When someone decides to smoke a cigarette, who pays for the cigarette, right? And who pays for the damage of the lungs? The person who's smoking, right? So obviously the smoker lungs are getting damaged, and it is the smoker who is paying for the, paying for the fee, paying for the cost of buying cigarettes and all that stuff, right? So that is private cost. But in the process of smoking, that smoker is also making other people around him or her take the passive smoking, right? To inhale the smoke, right? Accidents can be external cost if it's the mistake. Excellent, excellent, absolutely correct. So if someone is overspeeding on the road, so that person is not only creating a safety hazard for themselves, but they're also creating a safety hazard for the people who are on the road, right? Other people who are driving and so on. Excellent example, right? So this is what social cost is, right? So social cost is the total cost to the society, which is made up of private cost and external cost, right? Okay. Similarly, social benefit, which is the total benefit to a society of any action or transaction, also comprises of two components, in which are private benefit, like the benefit that is directly received by the person who's involved in the transaction, and external benefit, right? So the person who is not directly involved in the transaction, but he or she gets the benefit. So if I have to give you an example of this thing, right? So just imagine if a person is using their car, so what benefit do they get? The owner of the car gets the benefit that it saves their time. They don't have to travel through public transport, which is a little inconvenient compared to a private car, right? So the convenience and the time that they save, that is their private benefit, right? Simple and easy. But sometimes the other people also get a benefit from our car. How so? Think about it. So if you're giving a free ride to your friend, right? If you're giving a free ride to your friend and you drop them, pick them from some place, drop them someplace else, and so on. So they are also getting a benefit for you from your car without needing to pay for it, right? Exactly, left. So very great. Similarly, think about it. If I have planted a lot of trees in my garden and a lot of plants in my garden, we know as per the research that green plants create healthy oxygen and all that stuff. So other people who did not plant those trees, my neighbors and all that, they also get a benefit out of that. So that is external benefit. Okay, now this being said, right, we'll move on and look at the graph. We'll move on and look at the graph. And then I'll be able to explain you that what does it mean to the internalize the external cost. Okay. Now let's think of a business that is producing something, anything, right? And they're causing pollution, air pollution, water pollution, and so on, right? So on the y-axis, you have cost and benefit. On the y-axis, you will have cost and benefit. So we are about to make the graph of negative externality. And on the x-axis, you have quantity of good, whatever good is being produced. So the first thing I told you that you need to make to the externality graph is the downward sloping MPB, marginal private benefit. What is that? Marginal private benefit, right? Upward sloping will be your marginal private cost, right? So private cost and private benefit, and the word marginal means just additional, right? So you do not need to get confused with the word marginal. Marginal only means anything that is additional, right? Marginal private cost, marginal private benefit. Where the marginal private cost and marginal private benefit intersect, that is the point where the market consumes. That is because, think about this, my decision to use my car will only be based on two factors. How much is the benefit that I get, me as an individual, right? And how much is the cost that I will have to pay? So how much is the benefit I get from using my own car, and how much is the cost I have to pay from using my car in terms of fuel and all that stuff? So that thing is my consumption. That will determine how much I will use my car. Okay, but I know that in the process of using my car, there's not only private cost, involved, that also involves external cost, because my car causes pollution just like any other car in the world. So when I add the external cost, the pollution cost of my car, that will give me the social cost. When you add the external cost, right? When you add the external cost here with the private cost, that will give you the social cost. And therefore, the social cost graph will be higher than this. Marginal social cost graph will be higher than the private cost graph. Is this making sense? Bob, are you getting what is happening over here? So let's say for each liter of fuel that my car consumes, that causes a pollution worth 10 rupees. For each liter of fuel that I use in my car, for 1 liter of fuel, if my car drives for 10 kilometers or 11 kilometers, or whatever, right, that is causing a pollution worth 10 rupees. So we need to give it an estimate in terms of a value, in terms of a number. So when we do that, right, so that shifts your social cost graph upwards. Is making sense, right? So it shifts your private cost graph to upwards, and that is your social cost graph. Now, your private benefit and social benefit is the same. So let's assume that my car is not benefiting anyone else apart from me, because I'm the only one who's using that car. So private benefit is the same as social benefit. Is this making sense, right? So where the social cost and social benefit, where the marginal social cost and marginal social benefit intersect, so this is the position. That is the quantity that the market should consume. That is the quantity that the market should consume. Yes or no? So socially desirable output is QS. Socially desirable output is QS, which is less than QM. What is QM? This is where the market is consuming. This is where the private sector is consuming. So we can see for ourselves that market is consuming more than what is socially desirable. Market is consuming more than what is socially desirable. So what is the solution for that? So what would the government do if government sees that the market is consuming more than what is socially desirable? What do you think? How do we control this external cost? What would the government do if the government sees the market is over consuming? The government will impose taxes. Excellent, right? The government will impose taxes, right? And automatically it will shift your private cost graph leftwards to the social cost graph, right? Because now the cost of production is more. So if, let's say, let me give you a real life example. So right now, let's say each liter of fuel in Pakistan costs 110. Then government did some analysis and government calculated that for each liter of fuel that is used in cars, that causes a pollution worth 15 rupees. That causes a pollution worth 15 rupees. Now, what would the government do? Government would add this amount as a tax, because this is the external cost that each liter of fuel is causing. So let's say you can say pollution tax or whatever name you want to give it, right? Then instead of 110 rupees per liter, the price will increase to 100 and how much would that be? 125, right? So 125 is the new price per liter of fuel in Pakistan, because that includes 10 rupees, 15 rupees tax as well of the pollution that my car will cause. So automatically, since fuel has become more expensive, people will switch to some other options like using public transport, or let's say carpooling, right? Instead of using their own individual cars, they can go in groups and so on and so forth. So that will reduce the consumption of cars in Pakistan, and automatically what would that do? That will shift your consumption, that will reduce your consumption from QM to, that will shift your consumption from QM to QS, right? So that is what you need to remember. Easy? This is simple. So this entire concept means internalizing the external cost, making the person pay for it, right? Making the person or the entity that is causing pollution or negative externality pay for that. That is internalizing the externality. Any confusion so far? So this is what you will explain in this entire thing. That, where was the question? Okay, right. This article refers to internalizing external cost. Explain what economist means by this. So first of all, you will tell what internalizing external cost means, that you make the person or entity responsible for making that cost to pay for it. That's the first part. Then you can also use the equations that I've just told you. Social cost is equals to private cost plus external cost, and similarly, social benefit is equals to private benefit plus external benefit. Then explain what economists mean by this and consider whether cost benefit analysis can be used to achieve it. And the answer to that is yes. Cost benefit analysis will be helpful, because what do? In cost benefit analysis, you're calculating this thing, right? How much is the social cost? How much is the private cost? How much is the external cost? Similarly, how much is the private benefit? How much is the external benefit? But yes, it has its limitations. What's the limitation? That these calculations might not always be accurate. These calculations by the government might not be accurate, because obviously it's always difficult to assign a number. Just imagine if I tell you, if I ask you as an economic student that can you calculate the cost that it it imposes on the society when anyone uses their private cars, it will be really difficult. How will you calculate it? How will you give it a number, right? So that is all what you need to talk about. So let's look at the marking scheme. Internalizing the externality, transferring costs that are currently paid by those who do not consume them to those who are responsible for that cost. That's the first thing. Same thing, right? My society is facing the cost of pollution that my car causes, whereas I'm the one who is responsible. So I should be paying for it. How can you make me pay? By imposing tax on the fuel. Comment on meaning of cost benefit analysis and explanation that CB, cost benefit analysis, can give a monetary value to the cost that I was talking about, which can then be allocated to the business. Comment on difficulties of calculating all of the cost. Exactly, right? So why is it difficult? Because it's giving value to something that otherwise doesn't has any market value, right? So it's just like saying, if I ask you that what is the value of the happiness that you get when you buy something like a new car or a new cell phone or something, right? So similarly, pollution is not something that is bought and sold. So it's not like a normal product like anything that is bought and sold. So how would you assign a value to that? So that is what you need to talk about. Okay, now for the last question that says, have a look at this. Consider whether the article provides sufficient evidence to conclude that market failure theory is inadequate as a government policy tool. Now, for this question, Arbab, now pay attention. For this question, you have to clearly talk about the case study. Consider whether the article provides sufficient evidence to conclude that market failure theory is inadequate, right? Like inefficient, or sorry, insufficient as a government policy tool, right? Okay, now for that, this question will move up to the case study and read what evidence the case study is providing, right? Okay, now initially it started off with saying that the countries are seeking to be more innovation-led growth, right? More inclusive, more sustainable, right? So climate change is a problem that capitalism is facing, youth unemployment and rising inequality. These challenges requiring rethinking the role of government and public policy requires new justification of government intervention that goes beyond that of fixing market failures to one of stimulating change by creating markets, right? This is not just about spending money on different products. It requires new indicators through which to evaluate public investments. Markets are blind, and the direction of way change they provide often represent inefficient resource allocation from society's point of view. Okay. This involves taking measures such as devising market mechanism to internalize external cost. Okay. Now, for this question, right. Okay. Okay, think about this. Let's read the question one more time. So for 6 marks, it's asking, consider whether the article provides sufficient evidence to conclude that market failure theory is inadequate as a government policy tool. So you will talk about both sides of the argument, that how just controlling market failure is good enough, and then so let's do it like this. So left hand side, we'll talk about where the case study is providing evidence that, it is not efficient, right? Like it's not sufficient. If the government is just intervening to control market failure, that is not sufficient, right? And then we'll also talk about no evidence, where the case study doesn't provide us any evidence whether it's sufficient or not, right? No evidence. Okay, now have a look at this. Now, students, have a look at this, right? So think about this. First of all, obviously, it says that it requires rethinking the role of government and public policy, right? It requires new justification of government intervention that goes beyond of fixing market failures, to one of stimulating change by creating markets that more fairly distribute both risk and rewards. Okay, so that is one part where it talks about, right? So you can say it clearly says, like the case study clearly mentions how government policy should be rethought to include more than just fixing market failures, to include just more than fixing market failures, right? Now, what does it mean, like fixing more than market failure? What else, right? Fixing more than fixing just market failure. Okay, now for that, the case study is saying that the government should stimulate and make markets more fair, right? Like how can you make markets more fair? So if I have to give you a simple example, right? So a lot of times new businesses cannot set up in the market because there is huge entry and exit barriers, right? And they do not have access to capital, right? That's why a lot of startups are unable to survive and so on and so forth, right? So for that, you have to talk about that the government should stimulate, right? It's clearly saying that, right? To the one, stimulating and facilitating change by creating markets which more fairly distribute both risk and reward. So that's one thing. Another thing that the case study is talking about, that just a second, and then it says Then where was that? Fixes problem not used to create dynamic products markets or it's limited covering out better savings. How government investment for large output, right? Um, Gains in transform economies, both influence demand, supply side policy making. Right, right. Consider whether the article provides sufficient evidence to conclude that market failure is inadequate as a government policy tool. Right, inadequate. Um, uh, Okay, but then, okay, think about this. Then it also says that whenever the government is spending more, that also crowds out the private sector businesses, right? So this is again evidence in favor of the thing that, that government should be fixing market failures, but then the problem is that it can crowd out the private sector investment. Should we really sort of include more than just fixing market failures and focus on innovation, focus on innovation and stimulating change. And stimulating. Right. Are you getting this, Arbab? Right. So that is one thing that is clearly provided in the case study. Then apart from that, goes against those critics stressed on how government investments cause both large national output, right? Then another thing it says that it is not just about spending money on different activities, it requires new indicators through which to evaluate public investments, right? So it does talk about this thing, which means that the current policy making is not enough. Provides evidence, this was the left hand side, and no evidence, right? So where it says that, right, so where it says the case study is saying over here, right, it requires new indicators through which to evaluate public investments, right? So that is also evidence of the fact that the government policy making at the moment is inadequate, right? New indicators. Now you can write this in inverted commas. Why? Because this is a text that you have copied from the case study. New indicators to evaluate government investment, right? So that clearly shows that the government investment at the moment is not evaluated properly, that whether that investment is even productive for the society or not, right? Shows that current government policy is not, current government policy making is not sufficient. Making is not sufficient. Now, this is a tricky question, right? But you have to read carefully through the case study to see what are the arguments provided, right? So it talks about what evidence there is, right? Does the article provide sufficient evidence to conclude that the market failure is inadequate as a government policy tool? So first of all, we have said that yes, it is providing evidence because it says that new indicators should be used to evaluate government effectiveness of government investments, right? Then we also talked about that, it says that the government policy making should be rethought and it should be more inclusive and sustainable and all that stuff. So it should not just be about fixing market failures, it should be more than that. Then it says that, right, however, this argument does not conclude that the idea of the goal of public is more than just increasing output, right, which are at present not done at all. New events that have transformed economies, right? But then it says, think about this, then it also says evidence that the government has been very supportive in the past and it has provided things that has benefited the society, right? So global positioning system, touchscreen displays, solar power and wind farms, for example, were all publicly funded. So government was doing things that is beneficial for the people, right? So that is again evidence that, the government policy making is sufficient, right? Right? government has previously invested in projects that have been beneficial. Invested in projects. Bob, are you getting this? That have been, and also use the examples from the case study. Effective like windmills and investing in solar power and so on and so forth, right? But what evidence does it not provide? So it's not providing the clear-cut evidence of what more needs to be done. So it's not providing clear-cut evidence of what more needs to be done. So it's again very vague when it says, making markets more fair, right? Okay, I get it. Markets should be made more fair, but how should that be done, right? So that is something that is missing in this case, right? So you need to talk about that there is no evidence that talks about how the government should make its policy making more inclusive, right? Doesn't talk about, case study doesn't talk about how the government policy making can be made more inclusive. Talk about how the policy making can be made more effective. Right? Okay. Now, for 6 marks question, we have talked about, ideally you have to mention 3 arguments, right? And 2 can either be in favor, 1 against, or 2 against and 1 in favor, because 1 mark will be for the identification and 1 mark will be for the explanation. But let's go to the case study. So let's go to the marking scheme and let's see what the marking scheme is saying. Inadequate evidence, cost benefit analysis has limitation, but it does not say what limitations, right? Directives result in inefficient public sector, although this is not specified. Why this is? There is crowding out. Private businesses are discouraged from investing by large government expenditure, which may well require borrowing money and rises in interest rate. It does not create a dynamic environment for new products. Current economies have to deal with changes of climate change, youth, and rising inequality, and there is no evidence in the current situation, no evidence that the current situation achieves this. Adequate. Government creates a bigger national output which benefits everyone. New products have been funded by the government that we talked about. Examples are given. Articles is mainly against market failure theory as a solution to the current situation, but there could be other evidence to support the justification, which is not given, right? Okay, so that is what the case study was. This is what the marking scheme talks about, right? There's inadequate evidence because it does say that cost benefit analysis has limitations, but what limitations in particular it doesn't talk about, right? Then again, although this is not specified why there is crowding out. Again, as I told you, right, that crowding out is when private investment is decreased because the government is investing more, because that increases the interest rate. Private businesses are discouraged from investing by large amount by large government expenditure, which may require borrowing money and interest rate rises. So it's saying that there is no evidence in the case study about how crowding out happens, right? It does not create a dynamic environment on new products. So there's no explanation for that. Current economies have to deal with challenges of climate change, youth, unemployment, rising inequality, and there's no evidence that the current situation achieves this. However, there's adequate evidence that the government creates a bigger national output which benefits everyone. New products have been funded by the government, right? Examples are given. Article is mainly against market failure theory as a solution to the current situation, but there could be other evidence to support the justification, which is not given, right? So this was a difficult one, right? So, right. Okay, perfect. So are there any other questions about any other particular topics that you're having problems with that you would want me to do, right? And I'll see if we can also have an extra class over the coming weekend. Right. Okay. Perfect. So I think from tomorrow onwards, we can also focus on some, right. Yeah. Do check that, right? Because if there are any particular questions, especially essay questions or any topics that you're having problem with, we can find a question related to that topic and do that in class. Secondly, from tomorrow on, we can also focus a little bit more on essay questions, and then we come back to the case study and all that, right? So thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow at the previous time. So I'll be changing the time, but I'll post it on the group because from tomorrow I'm also having classes for AS paper one. So that means that we will revert back to the original timing. So from 7 to 7:45 we will have AS, and from right, we will have AS economics, sorry, A2 economics, because we used to have A2 before, right? So we'll have A2 economics, and then from 7:45 to 8:30 we will have our usual AS economics, right? And for that, you were asking me if we can do topical questions. So the answer to that is yes, we can. But to be honest, since we have completed the entire syllabus, so I would say that yearly papers would be more effective. But we can see, right, we can do that. We can do that, especially if there is any particular topic that you're having problem with. So for instance, if Benz or payment exchange rate is something that you find more tricky, then we can focus on that and so on, right? Is this good? Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow then. Take care and have a good night. Perfect. Take care. Allah Hafiz.